Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hi there, it's Lawrence, host of Corporate Warrior. Hope you're well. Thank you for tuning in again. In this interview, I spoke with James Steele. It's the second time James has been on the podcast, and I was so intrigued and I learned so much during our first conversation. I asked James on again. James is a PhD in exercise physiology, lecturer in applied sports science, has appeared on 21 Convention and Ancestral Health Symposium. He's quite famous for his presentation called No Such Thing as Cardio, which talks about how we were able to very effectively stimulate the cardiovascular system through resistance training. James is quite interesting because he's only in his mid-20s and he's a bit of a genius and certainly one to watch out for in the future. I honestly think he's going to do some great things, not only in exercise, but in public health in general. In this interview, we do go on a few tangents. Certainly at the start, we talk about the philosophical framework called Objectivism. And the reason I brought this up is because he did a great presentation on this framework. And I felt that it's something that people can really get a lot of value out in terms of looking at exercise in a different way and using the objectivist framework to perhaps improve the way one learns. And I just found it to be quite interesting, so I asked him about that. I quickly found, however, that was a little about my depth, and so it does start off a little bit slow, so please be patient, because soon after that, which is probably 10 or 15 minutes in, we really get into the nitty-gritty of high-intensity training in terms of workout optimization, how to optimize recovery. And if you're a real high-intensity training geek, I think you're really going to get a lot out of this, because we really get into the geekery of it all. We talk about James's own training and diet regime and the way he actually goes about getting the best results for him. For all the show notes, resources, access to the first interview I did with James, and for more great interviews with exercise experts like Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, Ben Greenfield, Bill DeSimone, Roger Schwab, Luke Carlson, and soon-to-be Steve Maxwell, please go to corpwarrior.com. That's CORP warrior.com. And this podcast is brought to you by hituni.com. That's hituni.com. Hit Uni is a website that provides excellent personal training courses for people who want to become high-intensity training trainers. It's actually founded by a friend of mine called Simon Shawcross, who's a real kind of pioneer in the high-intensity training movement. And it's an absolutely fantastic resource. I've actually partway through one of the courses myself because I'm keen to just increase my knowledge on this subject. But if you are perhaps not interested in becoming a personal trainer, but you just want to really work on and improve your knowledge on this subject, there's a great do-it-yourself course as well. So there's a number of courses to choose from. So check it out, hituni.com, select the course that you want to do, and then add the discount code CW10, that's CW10, 10, and you'll get a 10% discount. Enjoy the podcast, and please if you get a moment, leave a review on iTunes, because it really helps me out, and it helps kind of expose these interviews to a wider audience. Please share with your friends and colleagues and family as much as possible. Thanks very much for your support. Cheers. So, James Steele, Dr. James Steele, is it? Do you prefer Dr. James Steele or Dr. Steele, or do you just don't care?
Just James is fine.
Okay. PhD in exercise physiology. I'm going to get the high level view on this. Lecturer in applied sports science, and you've appeared on the 21 Convention multiple times and the Ancestral Health Symposium. And have obviously helped produce a number of very interesting and eye-opening studies in the realm of exercise lately, which has been pretty cool. As I said, I just wanted to get started really by looking at, before we get into objectivism, I wanted to ask you a bit about your past. Like how did you get into high intensity training, and exercise in general? What led you to this point?
Well, to be honest, it's and I can't remember who I spoke with about this before in the past, but I'll be completely honest with you. It started off very much from my involvement and interest in watching anime, growing up as a child, and having a lot of kind of heroic figures in fictional universes that, as a child and as a young teen, I found very influential. A lot of the characters within those kind of genres are typically very physically oriented. There's a lot of martial arts involved in it, and there's a lot of physical conditioning involved in the progression and the growth of those characters. And I found that as I was growing up, I kind of related to that a lot. So from quite a young age, I was quite interested in making myself physically better and conditioning myself and trying to train my body to withstand different, greater and greater demands. And honestly, it stemmed from that. So, a prime example is growing up and watching things like Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball and seeing the characters like Goku in there who were constantly pushing themselves. And as much as it might sound a bit silly to think back on it, as a young teen, you want to be like that. You want to be super fast, super strong, and be able to save everyone and protect everyone, and that was really kind of my original motivations for taking interest in this. I guess from there is when I then started to look into, well, where can I get more information about how to actually do that, because I know I'm not really going to be able to learn how to fire key blasts and fly around the place and move as quick as the speed of light. So what can I actually do in reality to get myself to make myself into the best kind of physical specimen that I can. So that's kind of the origins of it, I'd say. Bit of a geeky origin.
Cool. Were you always, when you were at school and college, were you always set on, right, I'm going to pursue exercise science and that's going to be my life sort of focus?
No, funnily enough, not at all. I never once, it wasn't until I had left school and college and worked first full time in a completely different industry that I decided, I finally thought to myself, or my partner pointed out to me, I should try and make a career out of something that I was actually passionate and interested about. I spent, like most kids in school, I was reasonably, I was very able, but was probably a bit of a daydreamer and would rather be out doing other things than sitting in school. At college, I got this notion in my head, and this is one problem I think with kids nowadays. A lot of kids come out not knowing what they want to do and trying to do what they think others expect them to do. So I came out of college I came out of school, and the subjects I wanted to study at college more related to me thinking I should go and work in an industry which I thought was going to make the most money, and irrespective of whether I enjoyed it or not. So I came out and thought, right, I'm going to go work in the financial industry. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to study business. I'm going to study IT, accounting, maths. Maths I enjoyed, but it was very abstract at what we were taught, so I lost interest very quickly. And I came out thinking, right, I'll go get a job in the financial industry. Worked in the financial industry for a year, just as a kind of sales rep in a building society, and very quickly realised that I did not enjoy that one little bit. It was I met my partner through work there, and we're still together. And she's a couple of years older than me, and I thought to myself, well, I came out of college and I've missed my opportunity to get to university and do a degree or further education in any kind of topic. I've missed the boat. And she decided she was going to go back into school and retrain. So I thought, hey, why not me? I'm only going to be a year older than everyone else. So that's nothing. And I realise now, because we actually have a lot of mature students who I teach on our courses, sort of 40 plus. So you're never too young to learn. And that was it really. I made the decision to try and pursue something that I knew, that I was genuinely interested in, that I could think to myself, I'm spending time trying to learn about the topic anyway. Why don't I try and learn something about it and try and make a career out of it? So that was that was where I suddenly realised that actually the best route is going to be to try and make a career out of something I enjoy.
Cool. Right, good stuff. Let's talk about objectivism. So what I'd really like you to do, James, I guess for the listeners' benefit, is just to explain as simply as possible what objectivism is and what it means. And then from there, how is it that you apply this framework, this philosophical framework, to your approach to exercise and I guess the decisions that you make in your life?
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So I guess I whenever I try and explain sort of introduce objectivism to or philosophy at all to anyone, I always try and think back to first introducing. There are four main branches to any philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. And metaphysics and epistemology are the two kind of underpinning branches of philosophy that dictate, what ethical and political views, are most logically congruent. And most people miss. They're the things that most people don't consider, and they're the things that really influence as well. What sort of choices we make and how we go about interacting with the world and learning about it. And within, Ayn Rand always used to describe objectivism as being a philosophy for life on Earth as a man, or man's life on Earth. And I suppose in a nutshell, it's a framework for describing or explaining how we, as a man or as an individual, interact with the world and our environment, interact with the universe. And from her perspective, beginning with the idea of metaphysics or our kind of relationship with the universe, and what is there, what the universe is, the kind of big fundamental questions. There were kind of two different options that you can really take as fundamental stances on your metaphysical position. And from an objectivist perspective, it starts with the idea that existence exists. The universe it does exist, and it's something that as a corollary of that statement, we can say, well, if we're able to logically determine that existence exists, then that must mean that we exist within that existence, and we are conscious of it. That we're conscious of our own existence, and really that's the fundamental kind of basis of it. It's that there is an existence. We are part of it, and we are aware of it, and we are conscious of that. Epistemology is the branch of ethics that kind of stems from metaphysics or ontology, that then describes how we actually go about pursuing knowledge about existence. And epistemology, in essence, is the study of how we obtain knowledge. And again, within objectivism, there are two kind of fundamental or a fundamental dichotomy that's presented, and that is either we can go about obtaining knowledge for reason, and through the use of logic, through the process of non-contradictory identification, or we can opt out of that and go with the faith-based approach. So objectivism in and of itself is a very basic philosophy, and a lot of other philosophies hold similar kind of fundamental viewpoints as well. Is that existence exists, the universe is real. We can interact with it. We're aware of it. We're conscious of it, and that we can use reason and logic to learn about it and understand it and gain knowledge about the universe. So I guess really, even for people who don't necessarily take an objectivist slant on things, because objectivism, I suppose, comes as a whole package, from those kind of tenets and those kind of perspectives on metaphysics and epistemology. Ayn Rand tried to logically present a congruent ethical philosophy, and from that a congruent political philosophy that kind of tied all those together. But in terms of applying objectivism to exercise science or to any kind of scientific pursuit. In essence, that's what the scientific method takes as its base tenets anyway, is that, you know, there is an existence that we can observe and we're consciously aware of, and that we can perceive that existence, we can measure components of that existence, and we can learn, and we can actually create or have learn facts about it, and we can actually formulate that into knowledge about it.
Okay. Sorry, I probably made you pause, but I don't know whether you were going to then just flow straight into how you then apply that framework to, I guess, your exercise. I guess I guess what the point I was trying to kind of make is that it's not necessarily just that you can take an objectivist standpoint to that stance to that. As I said, what it is more about looking at exercise science using components of metaphysics and epistemology that are can't think of the word now, but are tenets of objectivism, but that are purely just tenets of a scientific philosophy regarding the universe as well. In that, you know, we can't just omnipotently know things. We have to observe the universe. We have to observe its the components of it. We have to look to identify characteristics of those components. We have to formulate hypotheses and predictions about what we would expect to see as a result of manipulation or interaction of those components. And really, it's just and this is where objectivism, you know, is very, very fundamentally scientifically based as well in its perspective on understanding the universe. In essence, it's the basis of the scientific method, and so. I from a youngish age, well, I suppose not so young, but from an early kind of point in my starting to research this area, started to realise that it's not as simple as just taking for granted or taking based on faith the recommendations around exercise science or you know, the claims that were being made. There had to be some sort of evidence for those claims, and I guess that's really the kind of basis for my approach, and you know, any kind of scientist's approach to any topic would be that the conclusions we can draw have to be based on evidence. The knowledge that we have about that topic has to be based on fact, has to be based on something that we can observe, something that we can measure. I suppose the fundamental way of looking at it is unless you can show it, you don't know it. So unless I can show evidence about a particular claim that I've been making regarding any area, whether it be exercise science or anything, unless I can show evidence for it, I don't know it. And that's the perspective I take on it. And I'm willing to speculate on it, but I'm never willing to make a claim as, you know, I know this to be true in the best kind of in the current context of the information that I have. Because you mentioned in your 21 convention presentation, you mentioned that, you know, as humans we are fallible, and we make mistakes, and you know, so much even now, having, you know, after all the studies that have been created, or should I say, published, that, you know, well controlled and double blind and etc. How can we be sure that we can't call these sorts of things? You can't define them as axioms, can you? They're not. You know, these findings. They're not fact necessarily. I mean, how do you see where I'm going with this?
I think there's a differentiation to be had between what are axiomatic concepts which are self-evident and non-contradictory and can be defined in a logical sense, as opposed to facts which are observations or you know, data points for use of a better phrase, that we have about the universe. And they may, as I said when I kind of presented on the idea of objectivism and its epistemology, we have a number of different ways of learning facts about the universe, about its components. We can actually perceive them with our senses, but we know, you know, we have evidence that suggests that they can be affected, and they can, as you say, we're not infallible, and our senses can deceive us. Our senses can't see the tiny atoms and molecules that make up the world around us, but with the use of mathematics and the use of scientific measurement and other tools at our disposal, we're able to, for all intents and purposes, extend our perceptual awareness to be able to identify these things. So facts are not necessarily, facts are always up for debate. There's always the potential for there to be error in observations. And this is where when we say something to be true, when we're looking at things from an epistemology based around this kind of idea, is that we're saying that to the best of our with all the current information available and what I can present and use to evidence this perspective, I know this to be true in the light of kind of the best evidence available. That's not to say that it is a universal axiomatic truth. The only place we can really get those kind of statements is in metaphysics and in kind of logic. And in mathematics itself. Within science, we're always a lot more tentative in our approach to that. So there's always the potential for measurement errors within one of our observations, which can then lead us to question previously held facts and therefore have to alter our conclusions as well. So it's not necessarily about taking, saying that this is an objective truth. When we say something is an objective truth, what we mean is I know this to be true based on all the facts I currently have available. I can't know any better than what the facts presented to me actually are.
Right, okay. Yeah, I got you. You've kind of maybe have an epiphany then, which is that just the way, like you said, scientists should go about exploring all of these concepts is very much draws parallels to the Objectivism framework. So you kind of like answered all of my questions in one go with that. But no, that's it's such a complex thing to me, Objectivism, but it's fascinating and something I want to learn more about. But I think it's just a really healthy way of looking at things, and something that people can learn about and then use when they're trying to progress through their training, and when they're trying to learn additional concepts, so when they're reading additional studies and books and things like that. Cool. Okay, so just moving on, just changing gears slightly. I just want to talk to you about recovery quickly. And actually, first, before I talk about recovery, I'll talk to you about some of the guests I've spoken to have mentioned that once you train to 90% failure, 90% of failure, so before you go to MMF, momentary muscular failure, there is after that a kind of diminishing return. But when we spoke last time, I think you were always saying that no, to get the best stimulus, you should train, or there are studies to say that show that you should train to momentary muscular failure. Just wondered if you might be able to clarify that for me.
Yeah, sure. Actually, leading on from the discussion we've just had, that's a great example to use, I think.
Okay.
You often get a lot of people, or I often hear people, and it's and I don't like the way they phrase it, but I know what they actually mean, who say this is something that I know but can't yet prove, kind of thing. But what they mean is this is something that I speculate might be true, but haven't yet got any proof for. Because as I said, if you can't show it, you don't know it yet. You can speculate on it. And this is one of the things the problem with looking at trying to differentiate points within a continuum with regards to say the bottom end of a continuum when we're talking about training a level of effort within training. Would be doing nothing, and the other end of the continuum is reaching actual momentary muscular failure, where the force producing capacity of the muscle it does not meet the external demands of the resistance being provided. The problem is that people sometimes pull these numbers out of the air, 90%, once you get to 90%, that's all. And the thing is, we don't actually know that yet, because we haven't got any surefire way of saying you've got to 90% of failure. The closest we can get to trying to determine this is in studies where, for example, as myself and my colleagues have done, is to get people to train to a self-determined repetition maximum where they think they're leaving one rep in the tank. So you get them to stop on what they think was the rep before failure. So if they tried the next rep, they would have hit failure. And depending upon how many repetitions they're doing, let's say they're doing, they would fail on the 10th rep and they decide to stop on the 9th. Okay, for all intents and purposes, they've got 90% to failure there. We've shown in our research that you don't get as good gains, certainly in strength and in muscle mass increases as well, as if you actually do go to physical momentary muscular failure. And we conducted a study with our colleagues in Germany, Dr. Jürgen Giesing and his research assistants, who, in well-trained individuals, that showed that if you got well-trained individuals to stop and leave one rep in the tank, as opposed to getting them to train to failure, that does affect the gains in strength and muscle mass that they're able to make. In fact, in that study, the group that stopped one rep short of failure didn't make any or the improvements they made certainly weren't significant, whereas the group that did train to failure did make significant improvements in strength and muscle mass. So it's entirely likely that there is a kind of hypothetical point at which you reach before hitting actual failure, that you get all you need to get. You'll get the best gains from that. But the problem is, currently we've not really got any way of objectively determining or when someone's reached that point to be able to compare that then to failure. So it's very, very difficult, I think, I wouldn't be willing to make those claims. I'd speculate that probably the closer you get to failure, you do start to get those diminishing returns. So again, say you would fail on 10 reps with a load. If you did 5, compared to say doing 8 reps, you probably wouldn't get as good a stimulus and probably wouldn't get as great a gains from doing so. If you did 8 reps or 9 reps, again, maybe wouldn't get quite as much gains, but it would be a significantly smaller gap. And again, if you actually went to failure, the gap would be smaller. But again, it's hypothetical. It's very difficult to put together a study design at the moment that allows us to objectively determine that and be able to make those conclusions, I think. So I think that comes into one of the. I speculate that might be the case, but at the moment, I've not got any evidence that I'd be willing to say, yeah, I know that to be true.
So you think it's a safe bet to just go to failure?
Absolutely. For all intents and purposes, the vast majority of evidence and the better controlled studies suggest that if you go to failure, you will get the greatest outcomes from it. The problem with trying to stop short or anything like that is it's always a bit of a gamble. And another reason for that is because actually people aren't particularly very good at estimating how close to failure they are. Another interesting study was done by, I think the guys were in Scotland, published a couple of years ago, that took well-trained lifters who were then instructed to essentially perform I believe it was bench press and squat that they did. They performed a number of repetitions and then were briefly asked, how many repetitions do you think before you hit failure? They gave them a number and then they said, right, go do it. And they did 5 sets of this. And for the first set, they massively underpredicted how many they could actually do. The second set, they got a little bit better. Third set, they got a little bit better. Fourth and fifth set, they were kind of getting pretty close to being able to accurately predict how many reps they had left in the tank. But for all intents and purposes, and that suggests even trained lifters aren't particularly very good at identifying when they really think they're going to hit failure. So that probably explains why the group in our study that's tried to stop 1 rep short of failure perhaps didn't make as good gains, because maybe they were further from failure than they actually thought they were. So it's a safe bet to just go to failure. And on the other side of that, there's not necessarily, as we kind of touched on before, and I think you might have discussed with James Fisher as well, the evidence to suggest that going beyond failure provides any greater stimulus to produce adaptations in terms of strength and hypertrophy. So, we've looked at pre-exhaust training and found no additional benefits of pre-exhausting a muscle and then doing, take it to failure on another exercise again. We've got some more research currently under review looking at breakdown training with similar-ish results. Having said that, though, and this is what we touched on this, I think, a bit last time, is that although, doing these techniques and going beyond failure might not get you greater improvements in strength or hypertrophy, that's not to say you shouldn't do it, because some people find it enjoyable. It's a little bit of variation in the exercise, and if it's going to stimulate and keep you interested and maintain adherence to a program, then why not? But again, it's not something that I'd be willing to say there's evidence and I know that you would get better adaptations from it, because actually, currently, to me, in the context of all the currently available information, I would have to say I know that training to failure gives you the best outcomes. That would be my objective standpoint on it.
No, it's good. It's a good answer. So let's just expand on that quickly. So do you define momentary muscular failure as when basically you are the resistance has equaled your remaining strength and you can no longer move it effectively, or do you define it as when you inroad beyond that and then the weight, your level of strength is now reduced much lower than the resistance?
For all intents, an accurate definition of it would have been the first one. So in essence, the idea is that you fail to move the exercise when the ability for your muscles to produce force falls to the point where it meets but does not exceed the actual external demands of the resistance being placed on it. So you fail to continue performing the exercise, and there are different ways of applying that, whether you're talking about concentric failure during a dynamic exercise or whether it's failure during an isometric exercise. I guess the idea of looking at inroad is again this idea of going past the point of failure. This is where you get into the debates in terms of the practical application of it. Some people will, as soon as it gets to the point where a load stops moving, or the movement arm stops moving, or resistance stops moving, whatever, the very instant it's stuck and it stops moving, that's failure, and some people will stop at that point. Some people will continue to push against that point just to be sure, and I'm in practical application. I'm a fan of using that approach, and I'll explain in a moment why that is, or I'll give you my speculations on why I do that. And then there's others who will keep fighting the load until it starts pushing them down. And again, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that that's any better than just getting to failure and stopping. And like I said, I hedge my bets a little bit, and when I get to failure, I push for maybe 4 or 5 more seconds just to check that definitely isn't moving, and it's not me who's perhaps let up on the effort I'm putting in a little bit. And one of the reasons I do that as well, and again, this is a little bit of speculation, is that we all know that some exercises have sticking points and some parts of it where the resistance will be greater than other points in the range of motion, and sometimes you can get to these points where I suspect that you start to perceive these differences as meaning you're getting close to failure, and a lot of people, as soon as it starts to feel like it's bogging down and you're getting stuck at a point in the range of motion, think, I'm getting to failure here. Or certainly, at least I experience that when I'm training clients. And there are ways of convincing the client to sort of continue pushing through that point. This is why I get them to continue pushing when they think they've got to failure, because inevitably what's actually happened is the resistance has increased, their repetition duration has slowed down, or the speed of movement has slowed down. And once you slow down the speed of movement enough, whilst you're under fatigue, it seems as though that you start to perceive that the resistance has stopped moving, or the moving arm has stopped moving. When as a trainer, it's interesting. You know, you'll be training people, and they'll think they've hit failure, and you're telling them, you know, keep pushing, and you're watching the weight stack, and you can see that it's moving. But to them, because of the range of motion of whatever exercise it is they're performing, it doesn't feel like they're moving, because they're moving very, very slowly over a very, very small range of motion as they're getting close to failure. And what I often do with clients is get them to continue moving until I can't see the weight stack moving any further if I'm using a resistance machine, just to make sure, because some people will pull off the gas just before then, because it's almost as though, and again, this is my speculation, and it's based a little bit on kind of my own personal experiences, but I wouldn't want to pin my hat on it, that it's almost like your brain gets tricked into thinking that it's not moving anymore, so you may as well stop at that point.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Let's just talk about recovery quickly. There are different views on this as to when, I suppose, what window you should provide for your muscles to recover following a high intensity training workout that's gone to momentary muscular failure. And it's also the view that, and I don't know if this is fact, that the stronger you get, the longer it necessitates a longer recovery window. I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts on recovery, and how much recovery do people really need following, let's say, a big five, just to give us a starting point?
Well, I think this is comes to the idea of training frequency. It's I'll put my head out, stick my neck out, and say a lot of the ideas around as you get stronger, you need longer recovery time. I'm not aware of there being any evidence whatsoever to support that statement. There are certainly not any studies that I've been aware of that have looked to actually investigate reduced training frequency compared to maintaining training frequency in as strength increases. There was one study done using the lumbar extension machine when all the early MEDEX research was done that looked at a reduced training frequency after, I believe it was 10 weeks of training. But they looked at it just from a maintenance perspective. So could you reduce training frequency and still maintain the strength gains that were made over that intervention? And the answer was yes. So they went down to, I think they had one group do once every 2 weeks, one group do once every 4 weeks. And both groups, managed to maintain their strength gains, but they certainly didn't make much more strength gains than they already made over the 10-week intervention.
Which is because they reduced their frequency.
Yeah, so what they were actually looking at was from the perspective of for individuals who might be going through, say, a low back training intervention for, say, a back injury or something like that. Did they still have to come in and train every week using the lumbar extension machine, or could you reduce it down to once every 4 weeks and just give them a maintenance program to maintain the strength that they gained? But like I said, I'm not aware of any evidence that suggests that. And on the flip side, though, I'm not aware of any evidence that would support the general recommendations or no real good evidence to suggest that a greater training frequency will result in greater adaptations. Now, there's a study that was literally published, I think, last week from Brad Schoenfeld and some of his colleagues that did look kind of at this question, looked at the idea of in well-trained lifters, a volume equated comparison between a full body and a split training regime. And they did find slightly greater gains in the full body training group, which obviously trained their muscles, the same muscle groups more frequently, although using the same volume. So in theory, there was less recovery in between for the individually trained muscles. So that there's perhaps a little bit of evidence actually to the contrary of the kind of general HIIT recommendations, that a slightly greater frequency might be more beneficial. But again, there's only really that one good study that's recently come out to suggest that. Up until this point, like we've said in our previous papers, there's actually very little evidence, certainly for muscular hypertrophy, around training frequency and what the ideal kind of frequency is, and as a corollary, what the ideal kind of recovery time is. Certainly for strength, most people are okay once 2 times a week. That doesn't seem to affect gains, and it doesn't seem to enhance gains if you do much more than that. But on a pragmatic, practical kind of perspective, the problem with all this research is, or certainly not the problem, but what's got to be taken into consideration when you do take the results to apply, is that obviously there will be inter-individual variation in the responses that you get. So, you'll get a group of people to do a training intervention, and there will be a variation in those responses. And although on average we might be able to say, well, everyone will do okay training twice a week, no different from once, no different from 3 times a week, or whatever, we could recommend this to and the majority of people would do okay on that. But actually, you or me or someone else might be one of the individuals who fell on the other end of the bell curve, who actually need a slightly greater frequency or need a slightly reduced frequency. So although you can make a general recommendation around frequency and sort of recovery, and most people do fine with training once a week. Most people could probably train twice a week and be fine. Some people can train 3 times a week and be fine. Some people can train more than that. Some people can train once every 2 weeks and not have any real sort of effect on their rate of improvement. But on an individual perspective, you need to start with a particular frequency and then experiment on an individual basis with increasing and decreasing that to see what your ideal kind of recovery time is. And obviously a host of external factors will affect that as well. So, nutrition, sleep patterns, stress, and so on.
That's really interesting, because now I'm a huge fan of Dr. Doug McGuff and Body by Science, so I don't want to sound like I'm attacking Body by Science, because I'm not. But I think it's healthy to be speculative, as I think you would agree. Because I did go from Big 5 to hyper-abbreviated freeway split, and I felt that I lost muscle mass. Probably not strength, but I definitely lost muscle mass over that time. And actually, I told you an email. I had a catch up with Simon Shawcross, and he said, "Well, why did you move to that from the Big 5?" And I was like, "Well, I actually moved to a 2-way split first, but I wasn't getting stronger. I plateaued." And he's like, "But how do you know you plateaued? How did you control your variables perfectly? Did you breathe perfectly? Was your cadence perfect every single time? Is it the same?" And then I kind of realized, oh shit, no, that's true. And actually, really, he was saying you should have, rather than just gone, changed it up the next week, actually continue doing what you're doing for a longer period of time and took a more realistic view on what was actually happening. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny, because sometimes I take it for granted that I can go in the lab and I can use very sophisticated devices to test my strength, and I can make sure everything's very, very controlled and see if things are improving. But not everyone's got that available, and a lot of people make judgments on whether they're improving or not improving based on observations that aren't necessarily comparable with prior observations. So as Simon said, the first when you first got in the gym and did a particular exercise compared to what you're doing now, or when you perceived yourself to plateau, as to where you were when you decided you were going to change things up, can you be sure that you were performing the exercises using the same repetition duration? Were you, was everything controlled to be able to make a comparison? And a lot of people don't realize that the comparisons they're making are almost apples and oranges, and and they look at a lot of these studies where we're able to use quite sophisticated equipment in the lab to be able to control a lot of external factors and a lot of internal factors, so that we can get very comparable measurements. people often take that or we take that for granted, and people often misinterpret their own observations because they just assume that actually they are controlling things.
Oh, that's a really good point. No, it's just really good to kind of get some clarity and get your views on this kind of stuff. Cool. Okay, so you're when we talked last time, you told me about the 2 full body workouts that you do. If I'm correct if I'm wrong, they're body weight workouts twice a week. Are they?
Yeah.
Do you still do that? And are they replicas? Those workouts for yourself?
No, what I use at the moment is I'm still doing exactly what I was doing. It's still they're both full body workouts, but they're A/B kind of routines.
Okay.
So on my A workout, which will normally be a Monday or a Tuesday, I will do a set of kind of neutral grip push-ups, so kind of parallel grip push-ups. I've just got one of these kind of door gyms that you can kind of hang over and use for pull-ups and yeah, and I'll either do it at home, or if I can get into the gym at the university, I'll do it there. Even though I've got access to all the other interesting equipment, purely because we've got a great speaker system in the ceiling, and I like to put on put on some music while I'm doing it. So I'll do a set of neutral grip, kind of parallel grip push-ups, a set of parallel grip pull-ups. I'll then do a kind of wide stance all sit to failure supersetted into slow bodyweight squats. I'll then do a set of dips and then a set of bodyweight rows, and I'll finish up with a plank and just some kind of McGill crunches, which are very sort of short range of motion crunches, which Stuart McGill recommends. You kind of you bend your knee, one of your legs to sort of 45-degree angle, have your knee raised and have one flat to kind of stabilize the pelvis whilst you're performing those crunches. So that would be my kind of A routine. And the B routine is actually pretty much the same, but I kind of vary some of the exercises I do slightly. So I'll start off with a wide grip push-up, almost like I'm performing a bench press exercise using the bar on the door gym. I'll just place it on the floor. I'll also do a wide pronated grip pull-up. I'll then do a wall sit with a narrow stance, superset into narrow bodyweight squats. And then I'll do very narrow grip set of push-ups. We're almost like a kind of skull crusher type movement. I'll then do a set of close grip supinated pull-ups. So more like kind of chin-up movement. And then I'll finish up just with a side plank on either side. And I'll just do all of them, a single set to failure on each of them, and it'll take me with it's just enough time to sort of grab a sip of water, just catch my breath back, and feel sort of mentally ready to do the next exercise. It will maybe take me somewhere between sort of 15 and 20 minutes at the most to run through that.
What kind of cadence do you for your exercise? What kind of cadence do you work to?
I don't specifically aim to try and meet a particular cadence, but if it's usually around about a sort of 4/4 cadence, which kind of fits the range of motion for most of those exercises pretty well for performing kind of body weight movements.
One set to failure.
Just one set to failure on each of them. In fact, Simon actually recorded a video of me performing my bodyweight workout when he came down to the university last time. So, and he said that will be he's going to put that up on YouTube at some point. So you'll be able to see that.
Yeah, cool.
In fact, interestingly, we were having a discussion on one of the on a Facebook page this week, actually, because I've recently jumped into our bod pod at uni just to see kind of where I was currently at and compare it back to some previous records. And I had one from a year ago, and I was about sort of, I think, 8 or 9 months into almost exclusively bodyweight training in that time. I'd seen Simon about 3 months into it for a workout, and then I saw Simon again a year later, and it was quite interesting that he kind of made the comment that he thought I did look a bit more. I put on a bit of mass and I looked a bit more muscular and a bit leaner at the same time, and then I jumped in the Bod pod last Friday, and was much to my surprise had seemingly put on a couple of kilos of muscle mass and
Really?
dropped a percent body fat. So I'm going to try keep track of it a little bit now, and but I can certainly see it feels like a very sustainable routine. It's something I could definitely see myself doing, almost indefinitely now. I'll every now and then jump in and do a different workout, or if I go and visit a colleague, say if we pop to Newbury to the super slow gym that we work with, I'll do a workout with them, or if I go see Simon, I won't miss up the chance to have a workout. But my regular training is pretty much just that now. Awesome.
Okay. No, that's interesting. So when you talk to me, when you do say do your chin-ups, your 4/4 cadence chin-ups, how many can you do? Fresh.
I don't really know now. I'll probably get somewhere between 10 or 12 reps out like that. I don't know, because like I said last time, I've stopped kind of actually counting repetitions or anything like that, and just tend to focus on the movement. And all I'm really interested in when I start now is getting to failure. So as soon as I start the exercise, I'm on the road to that end point, and kind of try and conceptually remove any kind of external factors and just focus on the whole. On the movement and on the muscles performing the exercise. So I don't know. I'd have to give you a decent answer. I'd probably have to go. Hang on, I'll be back in a minute.
No, that's really, I love that, because it's just minimalism. Because like we were talking about last time, and this is obviously fresh in my mind because I've just listened to our last chat. But we were talking about how time under load is almost kind of arbitrary, in that you can still get strength and hypertrophy adaptations from much longer time under loads than what the kind of high intensity training guys recommend for the most part. And a lot of guys would say, oh well, if you can do body weight pull-ups for 2 minutes, then you should really throw a 20 kilogram weight round your waist or whatever it is. But you're saying that rather than that, you would just continue going, and with body weight, knowing that you're going to get the same benefit than if you added resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not convinced there's any evidence that there's the need for progressive overload in terms of load. It's a phrase that's often thrown around. You need to be progressively increasing the resistance you're experiencing. There's not actually really any evidence that shows, compared to not progressing the load, you get any different outcomes. In fact, we're planning on looking at that in a bit more of a controlled study at some point in the future, where we want to get one group that trains to failure and just uses the same load from the beginning of the study to the end of the study, and one group that we actually do increase the load when they hit a certain load duration. There's not really any evidence for that. And from a practical perspective, I quite frankly don't want to have to keep buying increasing weight vests, or having to steal all the tins out of the cupboard and jars out of the cupboard to put in my backpack. So from my minimalist perspective, I've got 2 bits of equipment that I use at home, and that's a cheap suspension trainer for bodyweight rows and my door gym, and that's it.
Cool. Yeah, because when we last spoke, you said based on your training records, I think it's from like the age of 21 to 25 or 26 or whatever, you'd put on about 15 pounds of muscle when you were 6% body fat. And that, looking back, you were pretty impressed with that. So I think you were at like 72 kilograms back then. Got to sound like I'm a real stalker, don't I? But it's only because I just listened to our chat. But have you? I assume you're quite a bit over near 80 now, based on what you just said.
No. I was I was probably around about 68 then. I'm about 72 now. And in fact, actually, last year, when I jumped into the Bod pod, I had 4 previous tests on there. I had one from 2010 where I was, I'm skeptical as to whether this was an accurate result or not, or whether we had happened to forget to calibrate the machine when I took the measurement. But it did say I was 4.7% body fat at 68, about 68 kilos. There was another one in 2011, which I think was more accurate, which was about 8 or 9% body fat and 67, just under 68 kilos. Last year was around about 9%, I think it's 68. No, sorry, 70, and the one I took last Friday, I was at just over 72 kilos and about 8% body fat there. But again, the measurements are always subject to error in terms of repeated measurements. There's probably a range of about 2 to 3% error potentially in those kind of measurements. So it could be anything up or down from there. But I'm jumping in there at the moment over this period because I'm actually looking to just try and drop a little bit, see how low I can go in terms of body fat again, just to see. I'm almost tempted to see whether that 4.7% was a real measure or not.
Cool. Just last time we spoke, you mentioned about your diet. You mentioned how you do intermittent fasting and you generally work out fasted. And we also talked about how you can't. I can't remember the rope pushing analogy, but you can't just force a load of calories and protein down your mouth and expect to build muscle and lots of it very quickly, which is very obviously dependent on the genetic hand you've been dealt. So have you been able to, well, the question is, have you been able to experience, I guess, incremental gains year on year on a very basic diet of, say, 3 meals a day without counting calories? Maintaining a certain volume of calories throughout this process?
Well, I have for the last maybe 5-6 months or so actually been tracking intake for the first time ever, just purely because I was actually I'd noticed on the bathroom scales, and again, you take it with a pinch of salt, that it looked like I dropped maybe half a kilo from when I had that last measurement a year ago, and this was maybe around September, October. I thought, maybe I look like I've lost a little bit, so I wanted to just check that I was eating enough, because I do sometimes have a habit of I'll get stuck into work and not forget to eat, but realise that I'll grab something quick to eat or something like that, and realise I'm not necessarily eating as much as possible. So I thought I'd start tracking it just to check, and I calculated based on my RMR and regular sort of like energy expenditure over the day, what my maintenance calories should be, and just was mainly looking to sort of like maximize protein intake, and I've been maintaining that over the last sort of 5 to 6 months, just purely because I've actually realized how easy it is in today's day and age to just use an app.
Yeah, would you use Fitness Pal or something
track
like that?
Things. I always used to be very much against the idea of tracking.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Was that you or me?
I think it was me, actually, because it said my internet got disconnected. But as you were talking about apps and tracking.
Yeah. Well, I used to very much kind of recommend against tracking things. Certainly for your everyday folk, unless you're actually interested in being very meticulous over food intake. The idea of recording things and then having to go to a computer afterwards and plug it all in and figure out what you've got and this, that, and the other was always actually far more effort than it was worth. Whereas in today's day and age, everyone has a smartphone, everyone can download MyFitnessPal or whatever, and it's very, very easy to just quickly search a food, get a rough idea of portion size, plug it in, and be able to track things on the go. And I decided I was going to do it for a month just to check out, as I said, protein intake, see whether I was consuming enough calories, and based on my kind of estimated needs. And I realized how easy how easy it was. It just, because I did it for a month, it started to become habit, and now I've just carried on doing it. And there are some days where I don't do it. Like if if I know I'm going to be going out somewhere eating where I can't be bothered, I don't want to be the guy sat there at the table searching for MyFitnessPal to see whether or not the hors d'oeuvres are actually on the on their list or not. And there are some times where, like for example, today we had a conference at the university and they put on a lunch and I buffet lunch, so I kind of went and grabbed some food, and I thought I'm not going to sit here and do this now, so I took a quick snapshot on my phone and thought I'll just do that later when I got 5 minutes. I'll quickly add it onto the phone. But yeah, it's just become a bit of a habit, and actually at the moment, both me and my partner are kind of on a little bit of a joint kind of project to see if we can both drop a little bit of fat mass and get a bit leaner at the moment. So I'm using that to help with those, to just make sure I'm keeping my protein intake high whilst just dropping a couple of hundred calories a day and trying to slowly over a couple of months drop a little bit of extra body fat.
Mm-hmm. So what's your protein intake like per day?
On average, I get around about sort of 1.8 to 1.9 grams per kilogram of body weight. Okay. Which is not too far off the kind of recommendations, for generally quite active and individuals engaged in resistance training. What I tend to do though is I don't stress about any kind of food intake really. My regular diet tends to, on average, hit that kind of recommendation, hit the rough calories. So there are some days where I'll be over, some days where I'll be under. But in terms of a moving average, my average intake tends to hit that. And that's quite a nice thing about a lot of these apps nowadays is that you can see it day to day, but a lot of people might look at that and kind of stress and think, I haven't hit my target for this day, when actually the day before they'd doubled their target or exceeded it by 50%, and actually it's not too much of an issue that they didn't hit their targets for today, because if they look at the averages, they've evened out to meet their goals.
Okay, I just want to go back a second, because I forgot to ask you something. When you do your 2 workouts per week, how much time do you have between those workouts? How many days?
I normally train, as I say, on a Monday or a Tuesday, and then on a Friday or a Saturday. Okay. So there's normally, at the least there'll be sort of, if scheduling means I have to, then I'll sometimes train on a Monday, and then I might train on the Saturday. In which case, the following week, if I can't train on Tuesday, I'll train on the Monday. So as long as there's at least I never train, back to back. But sometimes there might only be a day in between, but more often than not, there's at least sort of 2 to 3 days in between workouts.
So minimum of like 48 hours, would you say?
Yeah. There's normally a minimum of 48 hours between sessions.
Yeah, cool. Okay, interesting. I should be paying you a consultancy fee, shouldn't I, for this?
Well, I'm only telling you what I do.
No, it's good because I think a lot of people pick up books like Body by Science, and an amazing book, and really gives you a good grounding on this stuff, and then they go off and read other books. But to hear it from someone like you, who's got a scientific background and has done it for a long time, and can actually go into the details of what you do, I think that's very helpful for people. Let's go back to you and some of the studies that you're kind of working on. Last time we spoke, you mentioned a study and I asked you, what is the study that you're most excited about? And you said you'd literally that day got an abstract from a study that suggested or proved even that there were no such thing as a non-responder to resistance training. But you kind of said to me, I haven't got the rest of it yet, so I can't really say if it's, legit. But it had kind of, it resonated with you because you've had that view for a long time, that there's much more to resistance training than just hypertrophy and strength. There are all the other attributes that it improves. So do you remember that study, and can you elaborate on the findings?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. And I mean, that's, I haven't got it up in front of me right now, but
testing your memory.
Yeah, indeed, those the study, was titled "There's no such thing as a or there are no non-responders to resistance training," and it looked at a range of different outcomes, including strength, hypertrophy, individual fiber hypertrophy. There were some functional outcomes as well. So this was actually a study in older adults. So they looked at things like chair rise time and a couple of other kind of functional tests of daily activities that are normally used in older adults, because they're quite important for them. And when I managed to get hold of the full paper, I had a look through, and the results were really interesting. As I said previously, every single individual in the study improved considerably in at least one of the outcomes that they measured. And as I said, they probably this is something which I speculate to be true, but don't yet have the full evidence to be able to say I know it to be true. It's highly likely that they also improved in a number of other factors that weren't actually measured. So maybe they improved in glucose tolerance and other things as well. And I guess this is something that I'd like to start looking into more. Start looking into outcomes which are typically not looked at in resistance training. It's actually something I've done in my research in low back pain as well. Is that in using lumbar extension resistance training, a lot of the time when people look at particular interventions, they focus on what outcome they think it's going to affect. So when you do a strength training intervention, people measure strength, or they measure muscle mass. When you do an aerobic, kind of endurance, aerobic cardio type intervention, people measure cardiovascular endurance, or VO2 max, something like that. If people do a core stability or motor control based intervention, then people measure things like that. And because they're convinced that they're addressing a particular pathway or a particular kind of mechanism of action, they measure those things because they think that's where they're going to get the greatest effects. And this is a prime example, but as I said, applies to kind of a lot of different areas, particularly just resistance training in general. But in low back pain, all the research up until recently that had looked at the use of isolated lumbar extension training in low back pain had pretty much just focused on did they get stronger, did their muscles get bigger, did pain and disability go down. But we know that low back pain, for example, is a condition with a multitude of other comorbidities and symptoms that are associated with it. So what I was interested in when I started getting into research around that area was looking to see whether or not using an intervention that was thought to address the mechanism of muscular deconditioning, whether it actually had any impact on other outcomes. And we've got a paper in review at the moment, which is part of my PhD, which showed that just by using a specific strengthening intervention for the lumbar extensor muscles, we actually improved participants' ability to control their back while they were walking. So they got stronger, their pain went down, their disability went down, and on average they also improved their ability to control their back whilst walking, or their motor control as well. And this is where I think that a lot of the time we in the fitness industry, or individuals in that kind of industry, get too focused on strength and hypertrophy when there are a number of other outcomes that are also important. Not to say that strength and hypertrophy aren't important, but there are a number of other outcomes that occur that are important also, and for those people who aren't going to turn into the next Mr. Olympia, or they're not going to be pulling 500-pound deadlifts, but who just want to get a little bit stronger and a little bit more muscle mass, they are also getting other potential benefits, which I think I'm really interested in looking into and seeing whether I can add it to the list of, well, I know that to be true.
Yeah. Cool. And what do you think is the main cause for lower back pain? Do you think it's deconditioning of muscle or something else?
Well, my perspective on it is that the predominant kind of cause is muscular deconditioning, or certainly from my perspective and my kind of appraisal of the literature, it seems to be the factor which probably explains why it's such a prevalent issue, and it also potentially explains why we get certain other symptoms associated with it as well, and some of the relationships between those different symptoms. But that's not to say that there aren't, obviously in individual cases, other issues that are potentially causative as well. I think one of the factors that are often missed is that with low back pain, or certainly with chronic low back pain, it's often assumed to be more associated with, or because it's more associated with cognitive and psychosocial factors as well, stress at work and this, that and the other, that people with chronic low back pain have probably got their back pain because of these kind of somatic issues, whereas, and I suspect things like John Sarno's books on I forget the names of them now, but there was a lot of writing from him around, certainly in the popular press, about how a lot of it's far more psychosocial and that kind of thing. The problem is that all chronic pain has, logically starts as acute pain. That it can't, you don't just get chronic pain. It has to start as acute pain. So what one of my arguments in the work I've done has been that what we need to be looking at is, what initially causes acute pain or acute low back injury, and what factors are associated with that, and then how does that gives us a clue as to what potentially causes chronic pain, because actually, it's a bit of a myth that most cases of low back pain just resolve themselves. When you actually look at the literature, most cases of low back injury and acute low back pain actually do develop into chronic low back pain. It's something like, I can't remember the exact figure off my head, but it's around sort of 70% of people with an acute low back injury or acute low back pain will develop chronic problems. And one of the reasons why the myth that it resolves itself has persisted, even within the academic literature, is because actually what happens is people go to see their doctors when they've got an acute back problem. The doctors give them some medications and painkillers and whatnot. It doesn't really go away. They go back and see their doctors, they get fobbed off, and in a year's time they've got fed up with going to their doctors, so they don't go back to their doctors. They've still got pain, but because they've not gone back to their doctors, it's assumed that they must be better.
Yeah.
So that's generally why I think that myth has persisted. But certainly, and we've reviewed the literature on this topic, that there is consistent evidence that people with low back pain, so people with chronic low back pain, do have consistent associations. There are consistent associations between deconditioned lumbar extensor musculature, both measured as strength and endurance, looked at in terms of cross-sectional area or atrophy of that musculature, and also in terms of objective studies looking at determining fatigability of those muscles. There's consistent associations with that factor in people with chronic low back pain, and there's a reasonably good amount of literature that suggests that there's prospective associations in people without low back pain, that people with more deconditioned muscles are at a greater risk of developing low back injury and low back pain. And as we know that the majority of that develops into chronic, it seems to me that ultimately the problem is people with weaker lower backs are more susceptible to injuring their lower backs, and therefore in the end developing chronic pain. And along the way they start to develop these other issues that come along with it. And that's not to say that those other issues can't possibly be causative in the first instance themselves.
Yeah.
But my current kind of conclusion is that that's a strong candidate for what explains the majority of the issues we have.
How much of this is caused by prolonged time spent sitting?
This is an area where there's kind of a lot of mixed research on it.
Yeah. Very controversial area.
Yeah, I mean, there is evidence that prolonged sitting in the same posture contributes to low back pain. What you tend to get is sitting isn't associated with low back pain when you control for other factors such as movement and things like that. People who sit all day but actually shift and adopt different postures during the day don't tend to get very much back pain from sitting. People who sit in the same posture all day tend to get issues, and part of that might be related to what's called the viscoelastic creep. When you put a joint or any part of your body in a particular posture, the stress is placed on it in that posture. If you hold it there for long enough, eventually everything starts to creep, and the discs in your spine, the ligaments and stuff will stretch and creep, and you start to get chronic biomechanical stresses placed on things, which over the course of a period of time can start to sensitize areas to be more susceptible to nociceptive stimuli, create kind of inflammatory processes to set off, and start to instigate all the things in process for a pain response to occur. But it's one of those things where again, people with who have got stronger musculature are less likely to experience pain and those sorts of things, because their backs are better able to deal with the functional demands of them. That's not to say that it will hold it off forever. You can probably have a very strong back, and if you're going to sit in a chair for 10 hours a day in exactly the same posture, it's probably not going to help you over the course of time, but it might slow things down a little bit.
Okay, so I don't know if you know this study, but I believe there was a study in Canada or somewhere where it compared two groups of people. One sat for only, one sat for 6 hours a day and 6 to 8 hours a day, but exercised every single day. Compared to the other group, which sat for 3 hours a day but didn't exercise at all, and they predicted that, or they suggested that the latter group would live longer, or less risk of cardiovascular disease or whatever, and then the group that exercised regularly because of the length of time they spent sitting in, a static geometry.
Yeah, I mean there are this is something that I'll admit I've not looked into as much detail as I want to, but it's actually on my list of kind of things to look at in far more detail. There's a reasonable amount of research to suggest that independent of the exercise you do, prolonged sitting is not good for you. And that exercise can mitigate some of the effects, but ultimately, something's got to give as well. And this is one of those things where I forgot. I completely lost track of what I was going to say then. Completely lost my train of thought there. That usually happens a lot more often than it's happened in our discussions. So you've been very lucky, Lawrence.
Oh, I appreciate it.
It's one of those things where there's a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that sitting inherently is bad, and exercise. It's not just about being more active; it's also about being less inactive. I don't think yet. Although, as I said, I want to take a bit more time to really appraise the literature before I, give a concrete kind of answer on it. But my kind of general appraisal from what I've seen is that there's not really enough evidence for us to give a hard and fast answer on that yet, as to what is the kind of amount of sitting that you can't get away with. What's the maximum amount we should. We can get away with sitting and still find that we get the health benefits of exercise enough to outweigh that. I think also, so a lot of the time you have studies that look at exercise and physical activity, and often times the exercise and physical activity that's being engaged in isn't necessarily of a sufficiently high intensity of effort to actually produce the beneficial outcomes that would potentially mitigate the negative effects of the sedentaryism coming from prolonged sitting. So I think what we need is some more controlled, better research in this respect to look at. A lot of it's based on self-report as well, certainly in terms of the physical activity that levels that are being conducted. And a lot of the time, people who think that they're exercising quite hard, when you look at the self-report or exercising for long periods of time, often when objectively measured, aren't actually doing what they say they are.
Yeah, and I think what you just said really could apply to that study. I mean, it may be a very poorly controlled study, and I think this is obviously a wider problem in society. Is people hear a study and they're like, "Oh, this study said this," and then they go. I imagine you get people go to you, "Oh, James, you're wrong because of this," and then you're like, "But there's good science and then there's bad science, and you probably haven't even looked at the study. In fact, they definitely know you haven't looked at the study." And that is such a problem, I find. I had another debate today with someone about cholesterol and eggs, and yeah, that frustrates the hell out of me. About some people are scared to eat red meat and eggs because of high cholesterol, but you ask them, "Oh, do you know what cholesterol is?" And they're like, "No, I don't really." Do you know the difference between the LDL and HDL? Okay, let's stop there. It's Anyway, I don't need to go on. I'm ranting. But you know where I'm going. Now, when we last spoke, you talked about. So you've got your 2 high-intensity training sessions, but you've also got a prehab, rehab, mobility session, which found very interesting. Would you be able to kind of go into detail on what you do in that? Because you kind of skipped over it last time. I'd be really interested in the specifics.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've had a couple of injuries in the past that. Unfortunately, as a lot of injuries do, one of the issues is, sometimes once you're injured, you're never going to be back to where you were previously. You can do your best to rehab it as much as possible to the point where you've not necessarily got any pain that interferes with daily life. But, you have these niggles and that kind of thing. And the idea of that session is to kind of, hold them at bay and reduce the risk of re-injuring them.
What kind of injuries are we talking about? Sorry. Yeah.
I've got my right shoulder. I couldn't tell you what I did to it because I did it when I was a lot younger. But it actually stemmed from training in an old spit and sawdust gym with a very strange plate-loaded incline chest press with a kind of movement arm that had kind of 2 pivot points on it. So once you kind of pressed out, after the moving arm moved out, it then seemed to kind of move up. So the load that you were able to kind of press out, you were then suddenly holding in a front raise. And I moved back in those days when I was probably training a lot more recklessly than I do now. I blasted out a rep and was suddenly in a position where I was trying to hold a pretty heavy load in a very compromising position, and my shoulder just gave way. And that caused me a bit of jip for a while, and every now and then it does now. So I do a lot of stuff for sort of a rotator cuff and the muscles around my shoulder. So I'll do some just using like a cable pulley or a resistance band, just to do some internal external rotations. With a lot of these exercises, I'll typically do a single set to failure, but I won't be so sort of I'm not as focused on sort of like getting the workout benefits from it. And if I feel like I need to maybe loosen it up a bit more, I'll maybe do an additional set or 2 just to kind of get the movement going, increase that kind of synovial fluid in the joint and get it, for use of a better term, a bit more lubricated and moving easy. I fell off my bike a year and a half ago as well, and had quite a bad injury to my pelvis. In fact, I I fell off my bike while I wasn't moving. I'll just let you know that.
Right.
I just got myself a new road bike, and I hadn't got round to changing the pedals over to my cycling shoes to put my SPD SLs in, and so I just had the old toe clips, and my lace got caught in the toe clip as I stopped at a junction, and I couldn't get it out. I went tumbling over. And I managed to land on hit my pelvis on the curb, and hit it with a reasonable enough amount of force that I caused quite a significant sort of lateral pelvic shift. So I kind of knocked my pelvis out of place a little bit, and I herniated a disc in my back, not badly, but enough to cause a bit of sciatic issues. But what happened is because of the pelvic shift, I kind of caused a bit of nerve damage on my left side. So I've got some problems with my left calf where it doesn't quite get the same sort of innervation as it should do. So it gets a bit confused easily. So every now and then I'll be sat there and it will look like things are crawling through my left calf because it's just randomly got motor units firing off as nerve impulses are traveling down when they shouldn't necessarily be, and it'll randomly cramp. But so I do some stuff just to kind of like retrain the motor control of that, because after that injury it was quite interesting. I found that I literally could not consciously contract my gastrocnemius or soleus in my left leg, and it took a couple of months before I could actually even kind of consciously contract them. It was amazing the atrophy that occurred just over that period. And then obviously I had the kind of pelvic injury and the issues with the low back to be rehabbed from that as well. So from because of the pelvic and low back injuries that I've had in the past, I'll do, and because of the nerve issues that were accompanied with them as well, what I found was after that injury, although I could get on, for example, the lumbar extension machine and re-strengthen the muscles, one of the things that was affected a lot was just the motor control around that area. So I found that I was very uncoordinated in my hip and kind of lumbar pelvic complex in terms of bending and picking things over, and so I started to reincorporate deadlifts and those type of movements into that session to just retrain the skill of being able to, in a controlled fashion, pick up, reasonably heavy objects off the floor. I think that's a useful skill to have in everyday life. So I don't actually do it every week now. I've started to sort of taper down where I don't really have any problems with those injuries at the moment, and I'll do it like for example this week. Yesterday I didn't bother doing it because I didn't have the time to. But I'll chuck in either some barbell deadlifts or some trap bar deadlifts, and I'll go reasonably heavy for what I can handle, but I won't go anywhere near as heavy as I used to when I used to use the exercises frequently. And what I'll tend to do is I won't go anywhere near failure with them. I'll do sort of multiple sets of low reps with a relatively heavy weight, be quite far off of failure just to practice the skill and train the motor control involved with those movements. And then, like I said, I'll chuck in some things for my shoulders and some heel raises as well for the issues with my calves as well. But that's pretty much it. I won't really do much more than that. It probably doesn't take me much longer than my normal training sessions do.
Yeah. Do you think these kind of mobility or rehab kind of workouts are necessary for, let's say, myself? I broke my arm many years ago, but I have no problems or injuries that have been sustained. So do you think that for someone like myself that would be necessary? But that being said, actually, for a caveat in there, is that I am desk bound. Probably 6 hours a day, but I do move around as much as possible.
Yeah, I think I kind of, I agree with what Skylar says a lot about this. Is it's as long as you can move okay and you can put yourself into reasonable positions where if you were to you're not going to need to be able to put your body into positions that a gymnast would put themselves into. But at the same time, you don't want to be so constrained in terms of your mobility that you could feasibly be put into a position in everyday life where you would be at risk of injury because you struggle to get into that position. So, and I know you play basketball, so I imagine for someone like yourself, it's probably not too big an issue, particularly if you're moving around at work as well. It's something that I think is beneficial for people with mobility issues, which normally applies more to people who have got injuries or prior injuries than it does to people who are generally already quite active and already engaged in some sort of training. That's not to say I don't think it could have some benefit. I just don't think there's necessarily any evidence that it's worth doing that over and above just doing anything else. As soon as I start to find that I've gone a long time without aggravating any old injuries, I'll probably start to taper down and maybe only do it once every couple of weeks, or once a month or something like that. Just because I'm doing it for a particular purpose at the moment.
Okay, I've started doing neck training, the 4-way neck machine, the MedX machine. Do you do any neck training at all?
I do some kind of time stack contraction stuff every now and then. But I don't tend to do. I probably don't do as much as I should do. Although, having said that, we are getting a MedX medical cervical machine at some point later in the year. So I shall probably find that I start playing with that new toy. That will be one of the only machines I'll be playing with. But no, I do occasionally. I don't. It's not a regular part of my workouts, but I do every now and then do just do manual resistance type neck training.
Okay. Do you? I recently interviewed Roger Schwab. Are you familiar with him?
Is he the guy from Mainline Fitness?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
yeah.
the X-Force.
Yes, exactly. So he was talking about X-Force, which sounded very interesting, and that it increases the load during the negative phase of an exercise. Have you had any? Have you seen these machines in action? Have you any thoughts on them?
I've not got any personal experience with them, and I'll be honest. I'm not, as I always am. I can imagine they're probably a really interesting device to use, and if I was given the opportunity to train them, I would love to give them a go. At the moment, I'm not necessarily convinced that there's any evidence that would lead me to strongly believe that overloading the negative will lead to any greater adaptations than simply training to failure with a regular kind of load. There's some kind of there's a bit of a theoretical basis, and there's some biological plausibility to the idea that overloaded eccentrics may cause a greater amount of kind of microtrauma, which may stimulate to a greater degree processes associated with controlling muscular hypertrophy adaptations. But there's not a great deal of there's certainly not a large enough amount of evidence for me to think that definitely that's a better way to train. I think at the moment it's another one of those kind of techniques and tools in the toolbox that is great for a bit of variation to keep you interested in the training routines. If that sort of things applies to you. Same as things like drop sets and pre-exhaust and rest pause. I don't think there's anything magic about them. They're just another way of achieving the same goal.
Do you know, during a lot of these conversations with you, I'm acutely aware of mental masturbation, which you brought up during our last conversation. I
got that term from Skylar, I'm pretty sure.
No, Skylar's brilliant. I had him on one of my favourite interviews today. I asked the guy literally 4 questions, and he spoke for about an hour and a half. And it completely enthralled. I mean, he come out with some absolutely brilliant stuff, and hopefully he's gonna come on again and we can just sort of part two and expand on it. But no, very, very good interview. Yes, so because I'm always thinking with you, it's James gets annoyed about all the mental masturbation. He's more interested in his impact on public health. Is that true? Do you still have that kind of viewpoint of, look, guys, let's stop talking about how we can optimize time under load and actually see how we can affect the greater population here and improve public health?
I think on you're probably along the right lines. I mean, we're still doing research on, advanced training techniques and things like that. And because we are interested to see if there is something that's going to enhance the adaptations for people like us who are interested in this kind of stuff. But I've kind of got two strands to my research. I've still got my toe in the water in that respect, in terms of trying to investigate these types of areas. But I'm starting to realise more and more that it's a lot of it is more about getting people performing quality exercise on how do we get people to do that on a wider basis. And I'm very much interested in trying to sort of change the direction of the conversation when it comes to public health around that area. In fact, actually, it was interesting. The kind of, I say conference, the kind of symposium that we kind of had at the university today was with the local public health team, and it was looking at sort of public health agendas for Southampton and the local area, and it always interests me because there is always a big focus on increasing volume of physical activity, and there's never much of a talk about the quality of physical activity or the quality of exercise.
Right.
Yet there's a pretty decent amount of evidence to suggest that actually the intensity of effort associated with the activity that's performed is far more responsible for the adaptations that are gained from it. We know that those adaptations, or a lot of them, are strongly associated with all-cause mortality, and we've got evidence that compared to those who engage in lower intensity of effort activity, people who engage in higher intensity of effort activity also have a reduced all-cause mortality as well. So to my mind, it's more about trying to figure out ways of getting people to engage in even just a low dose of good quality physical activity, and whether that means we're getting them to perform, really hardcore kind of high intensity training workouts, or whether it means we're, like I'm looking at the moment, is seeing whether or not really modality has an impact on the exercise adaptations. If we can just get people doing something, but doing it well, or not even well, but doing it hard, then I think that's going to have the biggest long-term impact in terms of actual health outcomes. It's amazing that everyone still kind of dwells on this idea that more is better, and that we just need to, if we can get enough people cycling to work, or if we can get enough people walking to work, then suddenly the obesity epidemic will disappear, and people will stop dying from chronic diseases and things like that. And it's gonna I'm confident that will have some benefit if you can get people to do it. But if you're really struggling to get people to do that in the first place, wouldn't it be better to, if you can get them to do something, that's going to have the biggest benefit?
Yeah. James, I know we've been talking for a while, and you've probably got washing to do, but
wait for the washing machine to finish.
But I've got some questions I have to ask you, because this transitions quite nicely into what I was about to ask you. Fat loss, something we haven't really spoken about much. I'm assuming you're of the notion that exercise in itself doesn't burn many calories. What I find quite fascinating, though, is Doug's notion that even though exercise perhaps doesn't burn many calories, and that actually, if you look at, I guess, a pound of body fat being 3,500 calories, that it's really not an efficient way to lose fat. But I like Doug's view on that, the more mobile you are, the more fat loss potentially loses its utility, and maybe you lose fat through that mechanism. Do you agree with that? What's your view on fat loss and that notion from Doug, if you've heard of that before?
So you mean the idea that I'll just try and interpret what you're saying?
It's a crap question, wasn't it? Really.
so you mean perhaps that your body perceives that the more you're moving, it's less beneficial to have stored body fat.
Exactly.
Do you know what this and Doug is very fond of this phrase, as I said earlier. A lot of people use is that it's something he knows but can't yet prove, and I would suspect that is something that I would speculate to be the case, but could not yet prove. It would make. It's certainly something that you could hypothesize, based on an evolutionary kind of framework. It wouldn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense from an energy expenditure perspective that if you are high.
Do you know what it is, right? I think the girlfriend is streaming something, so I'm going to have a go at her in a minute. But sorry about that, James. Okay, cool. So you were saying about the fat loss, fat losing its utility.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is it's one of those things that again is going to be quite difficult to prove, because oftentimes we have interventions that instigate a number of different mechanisms and produce a number of different outcomes, and it's very, very difficult for us to tease out the relationships between the mechanisms that are stimulated and the outcomes that occur. But I think there's definitely the possibility that is something that could be true.
Okay, what's your view on if I was to ask you, okay, what's the most effective way to lose fat? What would be your? I don't know if this is perhaps your remit or specialty area, but what is your view on how the most effective way to burn body fat?
Do you know what? This is something that I've ummed and ahed and swung back and forth on over the years. And if we're talking specifically about body fat, it's something which is very, very multifactorial in terms of what sort of things will affect whether you do not store body fat, and I know that there's people who will argue it's all about carbs, and some people will argue there are other factors at play that affect insulin signaling and leptin and this and the other, it is something that's potentially affected by a host of different factors. But in the grand scheme of things, whether you lose body mass, it does in essence come down to, are you expending more calories than you're taking in? So I think from a practical perspective, in terms of losing body fat, bringing to an extent lowering carbohydrates to a reasonable level. That doesn't mean you need to be going full keto, as I know a lot of people do recently. It's become very, very popular, but bringing that down, increasing protein intake will naturally sort of increase satiety, which makes it a lot easier to kind of reduce calories ever so slightly as well without really even noticing it. But ultimately, it always comes down to a combination of factors of reduce calories slightly, while increasing protein, and maybe reducing carbohydrates slightly as well. Mm-hmm. Engaging in some degree of physical activity to get to in some way increase your energy expenditure, and at the same time performing resistance training, building muscle, which is just going to naturally increase your energy expenditure anyway. Yeah,
that's a good answer. Cool. Okay, so tell me, last main question, then I just really want to get your kind of book recommendations, latest books you've been reading, and tips for listeners. What is the most exciting finding that you found recently on the subject of exercise?
Ooh, I have to think. I've got a stack of papers on my desk at the moment, which I've yet to read through. I'll tell you what. I'll have a quick look through my Twitter feed and see which papers I've shared most recently.
Cool.
And that will give me an idea. Because the thing is, I notice so many papers nowadays. Here we go. This is an interesting paper that I picked up yesterday, and I think I said to you that I do a lot of my training fasted.
Yes, that's right.
And there's not been I've not been aware of a great deal of research around the idea of fasted training or perhaps training low carb or anything like that with resistance training. There's a lot around traditional kind of endurance modality exercise, and there's a good amount of evidence that training in a fasted or in a low glycogen state increases things like PGC1 alpha and AMPK, which are primary regulators of mitochondrial biogenesis in muscle, and there's evidence as well that training in those states produces greater improvements in things like VO2 max and that kind of thing. Okay. And as you know, I'm of the conclusion that resistance training stimulates the same pathways, and that you can improve VO2 max and aerobic capacity through performing resistance training, assuming the intensity of effort is high enough. But I actually came across a paper yesterday that was titled "Resistance Exercise with Low Glycogen Increases P53 Phosphorylation and PGC1 Alpha mRNA in Skeletal Muscle." And in essence, it was a paper that showed that doing resistance training with low muscle glycogen. In essence, this was fasted training. So following an overnight fast, they had participants complete sets of leg press repetitions, and they looked at phosphorylation of these pathways, which control mitochondrial adaptations, and showed that they were enhanced when training after an overnight fast. This is one of those things where I like I said to you last time, I knew I think we discussed it last time. There was evidence in other exercise modalities that this was the case, and I'd speculate that would probably be the case for resistance training as well. But one of the reasons I did it was just from a practical perspective, because I found it easier, and I didn't really like training with a full stomach or anything like that. Yeah, so this is a prime example of one of those things which I speculated might be true, but could not prove, and did not know, and then was pleasantly surprised with some research which actually gave me some evidence for that to potentially know to be true. So it seems that resistance training during the fasted state at least potentially enhances the mitochondrial adaptations that would occur from such training. Whether or not it positively or negatively impacts hypertrophic adaptations or strength adaptations, again, is the jury's still out. I've not seen any evidence that it negatively affects it. I've not seen any evidence that it positively affects it. I've seen some neutral evidence, but there's a potential benefit from that. So that was the thing that most excited me most recently, as recently as day before yesterday.
That's very interesting. I'm just thinking about what you said. Doug always said that. I'm sure he says you often, you always speculate something, and what is it? He says that you will. Oh Jesus, I've lost my train of thought now. But you'll discover something, and then you'll test it later, and then find the science to back it up, rather than suddenly be in a laboratory and discover something. That makes sense. To an extent, then that's often true. Well, the thing is, as scientists, we oftentimes we don't necessarily come up with the ideas, but we're the guys who test it. But it's funny. I got into a discussion a while ago, and I with some guy online who's when we published our paper, that suggested that you could have these cardiovascular cardiorespiratory adaptations, improvements in aerobic fitness from resistance training to failure. Someone popped up and said, "Oh yeah, but here we go again. Scientists just proving what bodybuilders have known for years." And the point I made was he's kind of right
and some people have been saying that this is the case for years. But the problem is, until we provided the evidence, you didn't know it was true. You suspected it was true, but now you know it's true because you've got some evidence to actually show that it's true.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. It's a lot of people. A lot of people moan at us scientists for saying, "Oh, look at that! They're just proving what we already know." No, we're now showing you that you do know it, whereas before you were just speculating with regards to whether or not it actually worked or not.
Yeah, and you're actually showing the detail, like the actual adaptations and the specifics, which, just saying, oh yeah, improves cardiovascular fitness, it doesn't give you anywhere near the depth of understanding you get from the scientific exploration.
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, we look at specific variables that we know, indicate that concept and whether or not there's changes in it. So yeah, a lot of the time, it's. And again, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. Is a phrase that I've heard before. And often what we're taking is anecdote and seeing whether it actually works. It's a bit like our stuff on advanced training. Pre-exhaust is a concept that just started off as a training technique. God knows where it originated, but Arthur Jones obviously popularized it. And it was as far as he was concerned, it's a hypothesis. He didn't have any scientific evidence to support that. He knew that to be a good training method. He suspected it might be.
Yeah.
And we subsequently tested it and found that to be incorrect, or at least with regards to strength outcomes. So this is it. It's all about being able to you don't know it until you can show it. And up until that point, you can speculate that it might be true. You can hypothesize, but the good scientist and the good objectivist will always be cautious with claiming knowledge in the absence of evidence.
Absolutely. I just want to talk about your book recommendations quickly, but I'm going to tell you what you said last time, so you don't say the same ones. Body by Science, obviously. Okay, so yeah, I remember last time you didn't want to say any because you felt bad about missing anyone out. Is that going to be the same response this time?
I think I dodged the question, didn't I? No, okay. So
best books on exercise.
Well, as we've covered objectivism at the beginning as well. Well, I would suggest that people should at least go out and read some of Ayn Rand's stuff.
Yes.
Irrespective of whether you agree with it or not, it's enlightening to read nonetheless. If you can get through Atlas Shrugged also as well, it's something that you should put on your CV because it's a heavy book.
Wow.
But I'll tell you one book that I've recently read, which actually has been useful actually in some research I'm working on at the moment. Is a book called Super Crunchers by Ian Ayres, and it's one of these books where there's a lot of a similar genre at the moment. So the idea of using stats and using mathematics to kind of view the modern world and looking at prediction and that kind of thing. So it's similar. It's along the lines of similar stuff by. My mind's gone blank now. Like Nassim Taleb and
Black Swan and stuff like that.
Yeah, Black Swan, Signal and the Noise, and those kinds of books. But I particularly enjoyed this one because it spoke to me a lot with regards to the application of scientific method to genres or disciplines outside of what people typically consider to be science. I always find it really funny that kids at school. They leave school thinking that science is chemistry, physics, and biology.
Right.
And they think that they're science, when actually they're three different disciplines that use the scientific method to understand the areas. I always ask my first year students, explain to me what science is, and very rarely can any of them actually do it. They all, think they're coming to study sports science, and what they think that means is they're going to do a bit of physiology and a bit of biomechanics and a bit of psychology, because they think that they are science. But what they don't realize is that they're looking at different disciplines and investigating it using a scientific method. And we've got a lot of researchers at the university who in the social sciences, and I often joke with them because there's the age-old kind of joke between the real scientists and the social scientists, and I sometimes say to them, it's often not surprising that social scientists get laughed at by real scientists, because they say that they're social scientists, yet the way they're investigating the areas they're not doing in a scientific fashion. So they're not looking at controlling variables. They're not even looking at analyzing their data in a scientific manner by understanding the interactions between independent and dependent variables and these kind of things. And but this, anyway, back to the book. This is the long-winded version of why it spoke to me. Is that I've always thought this, that we should be looking at if you want to understand something, science is a method for gaining an objective understanding of it, and there was a chapter in this book which started talking about the idea of randomized controlled trials. And of course, being a scientist and having conducted many myself, I was familiar with it. But what was interesting was that it was talking about randomized controlled trials in business and in advertising, and the author was talking about how he had conducted a randomized controlled trial to try and find out which book title he should use for the book, to see which would be the most appealing to most people.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
But this is what really stuck in my mind. This idea of looking at the world from a scientific viewpoint to really try and gain an objective understanding of it, and so I definitely recommend it. I enjoyed it a lot, and I think it was because it really spoke to that kind of side of me.
That's awesome. No, that sounds like a really good book, and I agree. Like I still work in sales, and I'm always applying a scientific method to that. And I'm not. Whilst I think sales is kind of a science and an art, I feel like if you don't have the kind of nature side of it, if you're not born with the skills, you can still become great at it, and business in general through understanding the science and applying it.
Absolutely. It's a bit like we said, earlier with regards to training. You get. I worked in sales for a little while as well. You'll get people come through the door, and you can't necessarily predict exactly how they'll respond to you doing exactly the same thing as you did to the other guy, but you can know, if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, on average, how do people respond to you approaching them in a particular way. And if you use that particular method, you know that you're going to get, on average, a good response from the majority of people. And then the individual experimentation can come into it, where you start to well, this guy isn't responding as they particularly would, I would expect them to, on average, to what I'm doing. So maybe I'll tweak it a little bit and see how they respond, and maybe I can start to identify characteristics in those individuals that might predict whether or not they will or will not respond positively to this sales approach I'm using. And thinking like that's thinking in a scientific manner.
Yeah, absolutely. John, just think about what you said about how you have switched to looking at more, I guess, non-exercise related books. I think you started hinting at. You started looking at that actually give you more knowledge that you can then apply to exercise still. And Doug said the same thing. He quoted Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. I think you said it.
Ludwig von Mises, yeah.
Mises even, and Capitalism. And obviously The Black Swan and Fall by Randomness by Nassim Taleb.
Yeah.
And I did not expect that at all. And he said that those books have had a huge impact on his understanding of exercise and health. Would you agree with that in terms of...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I actually find that I enjoy in my, I spend all day out reading exercise science papers, and actually it's quite nice to read outside the box and outside in different disciplines. And what always really surprises me is that sometimes I have some of my best insights when I'm reading around different areas. So, I would never have started thinking from an evolutionary perspective about a lot of the research I was doing if it hadn't been for getting in some way involved in reading about paleo and things like that. I know it's tangentially associated with exercise science, nutrition and whatnot, but I probably wouldn't have got that. And as I said, I stumbled across something in Super Crunchers that actually has informed some research I'm doing at the moment. This idea of using randomized randomized controlled trial approach with online type interactions and that kind of thing. So the idea that you can click through onto a web link and you'll see one thing, whereas another person might see another thing, and what impact does that have on how that person will, what they'll do on that web page and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't have initially thought of that as being something that could even be done. I don't think of myself as particularly IT savvy. So
no, you're talking about A/B testing, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So concepts that because I'm quite into business and obviously building up this corporate warrior online business.
Yeah.
I've read a ton of stuff on that, and no, it's fascinating. It's not something I've really partaken in terms of doing A/B testing on the site, because really, I guess where A/B testing is effective is if you have, say, a sales page and you're trying to sell a product or service, it's quite good to be able to do an A/B test on something like that, because then you could change different variables like headlines, the font of the headline, the placement of the buy now button, to see what one is most effective and converts the best.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's fascinating.
And that's the kind of way I tend to think about things anyway. And but it was really funny. What we were trying to do was we were trying to do it in a very old-fashioned way. And through reading this book, I suddenly twigged, well, why can't I just do this online? That would make it so much easier.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like trying to still live in the 70s, trying to pull off this study that we were looking at.
Yeah, so dealing with biological people is not so easy.
No.
Unpredictable people, that is. Cool. So I'll put Atlas Shrugged, an introduction to Objectivism, how do you say that word? Epistemology, that's the one. And then Super Crunchers as well. Is there anything else, any other books that you've read, like a really hot book on exercise you've read recently that you want to add in there?
Well, I recently finished reading The Story of the Human Body by Dan Lieberman.
What did you think? I haven't read that yet.
I really enjoyed it, actually, and Dan does a very good job of telling it like a story. It's a very engaging read. It's interesting because I'm at the point now where, because I started taking an interest in evolutionary biology and started thinking about my research from that perspective as well, there are areas where I don't necessarily agree with Lieberman's conclusions on it, but it was still interesting nonetheless to read through and see what his arguments were, and kind of question my premises and think a little bit harder about some of those areas. But as a general primer on introducing you to kind of like human evolution and its kind of impact on modern health and that kind of thing, I think it's definitely worth reading.
Cool, good stuff. James, last question, and then I'll let you go. This has been the longest Skype call ever, although it's been kind of 3 calls because it's blooming disconnected. What are for someone who's exercising, perhaps they're partaking in high intensity training, and they want to make sure that they progress as best they can, what would be your 3 top tips to that person? Top piece of advice.
3 top tips. Okay. Pick a routine. Do it hard. Stick to it. That's it. It's I think top tips really are if you were to boil them down to 3 words, it's simplicity, effort, and consistency. And certainly for someone, you know, they're the things that if you get them down, everything else, as you say, becomes, you know, it might have an effect, but probably it's a bit of mental masturbation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good answer, and it's good because people will remember that. I think it's interesting, you know, like we can, you know, I can ask you all these questions, and we can probably mentally masturbate, for want of a better word, on some of these topics. But then when it comes down to it, it's, you know, the difference in the adaptation you're trying to kind of coerce is so minimal that it just doesn't really matter. But it's still interesting in talking about nonetheless. You know?
Exactly. You know, it's something we're passionate about, and you know, it will continue to interest us, and we might not be able to explain why, but there's something deep inside.
Exactly. Cool. All right, James. Well, look, thanks very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This has been awesome.
No problem.
And yeah, enjoy your evening, and I'll be in touch.
Absolutely, will do. You too, awesome. Lawrence. Thanks very much for having me.
Take care, James. See you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by hituni.com, hituni.com, the best website for online personal training courses for high intensity training. So whether you want to become a top level high intensity training trainer, or you want to maximize your knowledge on the subject of high intensity training to optimize your results, check out hituni.com. Add your desired course to cart and simply add the coupon code CW10 and you'll get a 10% discount. Thanks for your support.